To you who answered the call of your country and served in its armed forces to bring about the total defeat of the enemy, I extend the heartfelt thanks of a grateful nation. As one of the nation's finest, you undertook the most severe task one can be called upon to perform. Because you demonstrated the fortitude, resourcefulness, and calm judgment necessary to carry out that task, we now look to you for leadership and example in further exalting our country in peace.
Trustees and the staff. I'd like to remind everybody that this Saturday at 11 o'clock, November 11th, 11 o'clock, we have a wonderful Veterans Day ceremony prepared, and hope that everybody can attend that. Please do. And you too, Mr. Gardner. And I'd like to acknowledge the Director, Museum, Laurie Risch, who's back here, Executive Director, and two people who put this series together, Chris, oh, right there, Chris the Assistant Director, and introduce the Chair of the Exhibits Committee, who will introduce Mr. Gardner, Betty Lee Nordheim. Betty Lee.
I know I've said this before, but when we started this exhibit, I started calling the veterans. That was my job, and I loved it. I loved listening to the men who were talking, because we were getting ready to interview them. I haven't had a chance to talk to Mr. Gardner that much, but I know that he was in the Navy in the Pacific, and he was a tin can sailor. And I found out this morning that a tin can is a destroyer or a destroyer escort. And so he's going to tell you about his adventures there. Mr. Gardner?
Thank you very much. Well, it's truly an honor to be here, and I'm just so impressed with what you're doing with your World War II exhibit. I was telling Betty Lee that I'm sorry to admit the last time I was here at the Behringer Crawford was about 10 years ago, and things have really changed and really on the upswing, which is so happy. I love to come over to the Kentucky Symphony a lot, and also associated a bit with the wonderful history program at Northern Kentucky University. They are doing a magnificent job over there of not only recording, but having lectures and having people speak and that sort of thing. And then also, before I get into things, I want to tell you about the Tri-State Warbird Museum, which you'll all enjoy tremendously. And that's out at the Clermont County Airport. Just go out Route 32, or go down and cross, to Coney Island, and then up to 32 and out to Batavia, toward Batavia. You go past Jeff Weiler's setup out there, turn south on old Route 74, and it'll take you right to the Clermont County Airport. And there, it's a very significant thing because there's a big hangar where the planes are restored, and World War II planes. They've now restored a B-25 Billy Mitchell bomber. That was a twin-engine bomber. That was the plane that flew off the Hornet for 30 seconds over Tokyo, 18th of April, 1942. And they're restoring an F-4U Corsair, which was flown by our Marine pilots in the South Pacific. Baa Black Sheep, all that sort of thing. A Stearman biplane, which is a trainer, and then they have several AT-6 trainers, which was a low-wing monoplane. And that, when you took flight training, you started out with the biplane Stearman in your primary training. Then when you went into advanced training, you moved up to the, they called it the Texan, AT-6 Texan. And it was a fast plane, and it was really a powerful plane. And that was the one that introduced you to the heavier planes that were used in the Navy and in the Air Force during the war. So those are some things to think about. And just briefly about myself, and as you'll see, I like to talk about not only World War II, but some of the preliminary, some of the background. I usually start with World War I. But also, it's so important to think about the Civil War, the Spanish-American War. There's an era that a lot of people are completely unaware of, in the 1898, Spanish-American War, and the tremendous political and geographic significance that the Spanish-American War had, liberating of Cuba and the Philippines from the rule of the King of Spain. And so anyway, my experience, I went in right after Pearl Harbor. I was in college. I'm not embarrassed to say that I matriculated in college in the fall of 1939. So when 1941 came along, I was already an upperclassman in college. And a group of us volunteered for the Navy. And we didn't tell our parents about it. We went down the next day, the 8th of December was a Monday, and we went down to the recruiting office in Corvallis, Oregon, at Oregon State College, now Oregon State University, and signed up. And we didn't tell our parents about it for a couple of weeks because we knew we wouldn't get orders to move out for probably about a month. And we just decided, well, we'll just not tell them about it for a while. And of course, there were 4 of us who did this and together. And most of the parents were slightly upset. Oh, why didn't you tell us about this? Why aren't you staying in college? You know, you could get that extra training. You could, you know, blah, blah, blah. But the 4 of us were kind of like the 3 Musketeers. We were very close. We were adventurous, and we wanted to go to war. We wanted to, as long as the war was on. So that's how that happened. I served on 3 different ships during the war, from 1942 to 46. I stayed in about a year after the war was over. Well, up into the fall of 1946. But up to that point, my first blooding, so to speak, although I was not wounded, was in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, 1942, in the Solomon Islands. That was where the Marines were forced to repulse the returning Japanese forces who were trying to retake Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was a large island. You look at your map when you get home. Find the Solomon Islands, way, way down there, just a little bit east of Australia. And you'll see big islands like New Britain, New Ireland, Bougainville, Guadalcanal, and this was, of course, an extremely strategic part of the world. The Japanese, as you know, was a nation without raw materials. They didn't have coal, they didn't have iron ore, they didn't have rubber, they didn't have timber. And here they were, starting a war. Of course, they'd started building up their forces long before 1941. In China and in Southeast Asia, what was then called French Indochina. And you know where French Indochina is? It isn't on the map today. You know what makes up Indochina today? French Indochina now comprises North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and part of Thailand. That was French Indochina in the 1930s. Well, after World War I up until the late 1930s. The Japanese realized that, you know, we need all this stuff. And that's why they moved into that area in the 1930s, long before we got into the war. Ironically, we had sold them scrap material, metals. We sold them timbers from the great Douglas fir forests of Oregon and the Northwest. We sold them all kinds of things. We sold them technology, how to extract the juice from the rubber trees and to make tires and necessary things for war materials. It was so important. So ironically, they fired it back at us eventually, you know, and my dad was in the lumber industry and the timber industry, and I can still remember in Oregon as a boy, in Portland, Oregon, on the Willamette River, seeing these huge, big squares that they cut from the logs of the Douglas fir forest, 48 inches square, 60 feet long, you know, out of these great massive trees. Well, the Japanese knew what they were buying. And they loaded them on their ships in the 1930s and took them back to the empire and cut them up to their standards and built the forts and fortresses like Iwo Jima and Truk and other places of that nature. So they were very smart and they were very tricky, and we were an isolation type of a nation at that time. You know, we thought, oh, we're safe there. There's the Atlantic Ocean over here and the Pacific Ocean over here, and we've got nothing to worry about, you know. We're strong and we're okay. Plus the fact we were in the depths of a terrible depression. And a lot of people think today, oh golly, we've had some tough financial times in the last 30 years or 40 years, but I'll tell you, there was nothing like the depression of the 1930s. It was a very serious affair. And that was one of the things, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt realized it, and he didn't know quite how he was going to pull, in 1932, how he was going to pull the nation out of this terrible depression. Well, unfortunately, the opportunity for a war came along. And of course, immediately we had to build up our strength. I mean, we didn't have enough rifles for soldiers. You probably read about it. In the early days of World War II training, many of our camps and military establishments didn't have real rifles, and they trained with wooden rifles, you know, for manual of arms and things like that. So, but we built things up very quickly. And of course, being the greatest nation in the world, even in those days, we had the know-how, and we had the strength, and we had the ideas, and then the mass production of war material, tanks, like your wonderful tank out here, airplanes, the ships, so forth and so on, munitions, guns, everything that was necessary. So the war front, as we called it, the home front, as we call it here, with Rosie the Riveter. There's the wonderful poster that you have in the next room. Rosie the Riveter, flexing her muscle. By golly, we can do this. And the women and the older people who couldn't go to war, and all these wonderful Americans who formed up and strengthened our nation and built the great war machine that we completely could overpower our enemies with. We had a tremendous problem psychologically and philosophically. Many people in this country were anti-war, anti-militarist. We have a lot of that today, unfortunately. And of course, Britain got into it right away. You know, August 1939, when the Germans moved into Poland. And then there was what they called the so-called phony war in the late 1939 and early 1940, when the Germans had taken over France and Belgium and the Netherlands, the Low Countries, you know, Luxembourg, and the French were overpowered, and they sort of faced off each other in France. But the Germans had France, you know, they had Belgium. And so there was a period there of what they call the phony war, that was sort of a standoff. And then eventually, of course, Britain flexing her muscles, and eventually with the support of our great nation, we got in on the side of the Allies. And so here we are, and I'm sent off to the South Pacific and as a sailor, and I was aboard a small craft in the Solomon Islands called a picket boat. Now, if you've read Civil War history, you'll know what a picket is. It isn't a piece of a fence, and it isn't the part of the sign that you hold up at a football game with a D in front of it, you know. A picket was, in the Civil War, was an outrider, a person who was set outside of the troops to be a watch person or a spy, and to give information back to the troops, what's going on out there in the enemy lines and so forth. So this picket boat, idea of it was to be out in the waters in the Solomon Islands, and boy, I'll tell you, that's some of the deepest water in the world. I'm talking like 500 fathoms deep, and a fathom is 6 feet, so you can imagine how deep that is. And dark. Oh, I've never forgotten how dark it was at night, because there were no lights anywhere, of course. And in wartime, you don't have any lights anyway, because you don't want the enemy to see you or know where you are. So we were set out on this tiny boat. At night, we were out in the deeps in an area off Guadalcanal that was between a big channel between the islands. It was called the Slot, and that sounds kind of desperate right away. The Slot, you know, boy. Well, the Slot was the area where the Japanese fleet ships came in with new troops aboard, with supplies, and at night they brought those ships in, and then in the daytime they had their planes fly over. So at night we were out in the depths of the waters watching for the enemy ships to come through, and we could radio to the information to the command that would disseminate the information to the troops on shore, the Marines on Guadalcanal. And then in the daytime, instead of being out there in the water, out in the open, we were back in close to the shore under the foliage along the shore. And we were watching for the airplanes as they came over, the Jap planes, the fighters and the bombers. And the bombers, of course, were bombing Henderson Field, which was the Marine Air Base on Guadalcanal. So that was an exciting time, and I was on that duty for about 4 months. And then I got a transfer to another ship, and I got a transfer back to the States, very fortunately for me. And I got advanced training, and then went back out to sea again. And in 1943, I was assigned to a brand new ship called an escort carrier. There was a great organization, a great manufacturing organization in this country called the Kaiser Company. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Edgar Kaiser was a friend of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Edgar Kaiser was a highly recognized and renowned manufacturing genius. He really established what we call mass production. And he had this theory of building ships, particularly ships, small ships, landing craft, LSTs, LCIs, LSMs, escort carriers, small ships, you don't think of a carrier as a small ship, but the escort carrier class was the smallest of aircraft carriers. Our ship was 500 feet long. We had a squadron of planes aboard called a composite squadron, which means that it had fighter planes and torpedo bombers. And wonderful, wonderful aircraft built by the Grumman Corporation of Long Island, New York, and also General Motors built aircraft. And we had 12 torpedo bombers and 18 single-engine fighter planes called the F-4F or FM-2 Wildcat. And our mission as an escort carrier was ASW, which stands for Anti-Submarine Warfare. Because of the way our ship was constructed, the skin of the ship was a little less than a half an inch thick. We were not intended to be a battleship. We were to be out in the ocean. We would launch our planes early in the morning. They'd fly out over the ocean looking for the enemy. Then they'd come back and land, refuel, go back out again, and then come back in the evening and land for overnight till the next day. And our mission was to search for the enemy, to, of course, radio information that we found out to our central command, and we were under wonderful admirals like Bull Halsey and Thomas Kincaid and Ziggy Sprague and all these wonderful, wonderful, great leaders. So from 43, late 43 into 44, we were active. We supported landings in the Marshall Islands, which was out there in the Southwest Pacific, in the Palau Islands, in the Marianas. Now, the Marianas might not mean much to you by that name, but those were the islands of Saipan and Tinian, Guam, and Rota. And this is getting a little farther over, just north of the Philippine Islands archipelago. And these were all, of course, tremendously important campaigns. Our ship escorted and our planes flew over the land, over the enemy installations and so forth. So we got battle stars for all those engagements, and then into the early summer of 44, we knew that there was a tremendous movement by the Japanese fleet and the Japanese Naval Air Arm, their naval air force, which incidentally were the planes that conducted the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December. That type of ship, that type of plane. And we knew that they were moving south, and we weren't sure exactly where they were going to wind up, but we figured it would be the Philippines, approaching the Philippines. So in June of 1944, our carriers with our planes engaged with the Japanese planes near the Marianas Islands. And today it's known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And the turkey shoot means, of course, you know, for us it was like shooting turkeys out of the sky. The Japanese planes, by that time, you see, there's so much involved here, but you'll remember the Battle of Midway, which was in June of 42. In the Battle of Midway in June of 42, we destroyed 4 of the 6 Japanese carriers. They were sunk at Midway. But one of the most important aspects of the Battle of Midway was that we killed so many of their experienced pilots. So they had a terrible time training new pilots, raw recruits, to fill in the ranks of what was lost. So at the turkey shoot, The Japanese pilots were, they were pretty shaky in their proficiency and so forth. And our planes and our great naval pilots shot down over 300 Japanese planes. And that was really a decimation of the Japanese Naval Air Force. That was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. One of the interesting stories about the turkey shoot was that late in the day, and night was falling, and a lot of our planes were still out. And now they had to come home to roost like chickens, but it was dark. They were running out of fuel. They really didn't know exactly where they were. And we got all these radio messages saying, "Where are you? You know, where's my name?" The name of my old ship was the USS Cullinan Bay. "Where's the Cullinan Bay? You know, where's the Midway? Where's the San Lo? Where's the Fanshawe Bay?" They couldn't see us, of course. And our great admiral at that point was Mark Mitcher, Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher. And he was a brave, great leader. And he saw the desperation of the situation. Darkness had fallen, and we still had guys in the air. Some of them were going into the water, never to be seen again. And one of the absolute laws of the sea and warfare is no lights at night. You couldn't even smoke a cigarette on deck because the enemy could see the light of that and know where you are. So Mark Mitcher just discerned that, well, we've destroyed so many of their planes, we know that. We saw them go down, you know, in the daylight. And we've got all these great, brave young guys up there in the air yet. We've got to get them down somehow. So he gave the order, turn on the lights. It had never been done before during the war. And the carriers in the area, there were lights on the ship for landing. And all of a sudden, these lights came up. I get very emotional about it when I think about it because it was so dramatic and so important. And all of a sudden, the planes who were still in the air, they saw the lights. And it didn't matter what ship they were from, you know, as long as it was a carrier and it was big enough to land on, they were going to land on it. And we saved hundreds of pilots. We really did. We lost a lot, but we saved many. That was a very, very dramatic historical moment that a lot of people don't know about. If you read Samuel Eliot Morison, the great historian, you'll read all about it in one of his books. He wrote an 18-volume collection of naval operations of the United States in World War II, and it's one of the great reference books. Oh, and that brings up another point. You know, there was so much secrecy during the war. There had to be confidential messages and so forth and so on, and secret orders and so forth. Well, Samuel Eliot Morison had attained the rank of Rear Admiral by just before the end of the war. But he had been assigned by the Navy as a captain from Harvard University to be with Nimitz's fleet in the Pacific and to write about everything that was going on. You know, sure, we could take photographs, you know, you had yeomen to write memos and so forth and so on, but it was important to have a very experienced, practiced historian to write things down. And the irony of that was that, of course, he was not privy to all of the inner secrets, the confidential papers and everything, because there's such a thing as the War Secrets Act, which meant that you couldn't get into everything secret and confidential until 30 years after the end of the war. Well, that was to defend or support or protect things that had gone wrong, people that had made big mistakes. As long as they were still alive, you weren't going to embarrass them. But once that was over, That's why today, you know, you go to your bookstore, you go to your library, there's a new book every week about the Pacific War. Because all the authors now have access to everything. So anyway, Morrison was a great, great author, and I recommend him highly. I've also mentioned to you a wonderful book that came out 2 years ago called The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors by James Hornfisher. And it's a wonderful book. I mean, if you like that sort of thing, you can't put it down. He's written a book about the destroyers and the destroyer escorts in the Battle off Samar in the Philippines. And this was my last battle, October of 1944. Samar is one of the large islands of the Philippine archipelago. And it was part of what they call the overall battle, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And Leyte Gulf was a great ocean area in the archipelago, surrounded by the islands of Samar and Leyte and Mindoro and Panay and so forth. And by that time, late October, MacArthur and the armed forces, the soldiers particularly, had gone ashore in the Philippines, in the eastern Philippines, and were starting to move against the Japanese forces, because the Japanese had the Philippine Islands under lock and key for, you know, by 3 years by that time. And it was a very strategic position for them, and we had to have the Philippines back. So, again, more and more troops being put ashore, and the Japanese were getting desperate, realizing that what a desperate situation they were in, that they were in danger of losing the Philippines, and how best to try and stop that. What was left of the Japanese fleet, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, they had no really operable aircraft carriers at this time. There were two left, there were three left in the main homeland islands of the carrier fleet, but they had no muscle because they had no planes. We had destroyed practically all their planes, except for the kamikazes. Now this was when the kamikaze concept really came into being. And for those of you who don't know what kamikaze is, it was a suicide mission. Kamikaze is a Japanese name that means strong wind or wind of valor or something like that. It comes from a, 12th or 13th century naval battle that the Japanese had with the Chinese fleet, sailing fleet in those olden days. And the Japanese fleet was about to be destroyed by the Chinese fleet, and along came this tremendous wind. It was probably a typhoon. And it destroyed the Chinese fleet, and that saved the Japanese fleet. And the name kamikaze came from that, strong wind or whatever, and they applied that to this suicide mission philosophy. What else could they do? They recruited old men, they recruited little boys, some of them maybe a couple of years older than you, to fly these planes. And all they were trained for was to be able to get the plane off the ground, get it up into the air, and head it toward an enemy ship. There was no return. Number one, they didn't have enough gas. Even if they missed their target, they went into the sea, and because of the desperation of supplies in Japan. So we were caught by the remainder of the Japanese fleet under Admiral Kurita in October of '44, and our little group was called a task force of 13 vessels. There were 6 escort carriers, or baby flat tops, or jeep carriers, or Kaiser coffins. They had all kinds of names. And the Navy designation of of an escort carrier was CVE, carrier vessel, comma, escort. Well, we, you know, good old American humor and everything, we called them combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. CVE. We were light, you know, we weren't an armored ship at all. We got caught by the Japanese fleet off Samar in what they call Surigao Strait, which is a big deep water between the islands in the Philippines. And the Japanese fleet, what was left of it, they had 2 battleships. They had about 6 cruisers, and a cruiser is smaller than a battleship but larger than a destroyer, and several destroyers. And they were on sort of a kamikaze mission, except they fired at us and we got hit 25 times by surface vessels. But everything went through us because they thought that we were heavily armored major warships. They didn't realize. And they had timed their projectiles to penetrate heavy armor and explode instead of contact, exploding on contact. And we took 25 hits we got 1 hit from a 16-inch rifle, which we later found out came from the great battleship Yamato, and which was eventually sunk in the Battle of Okinawa in April of 1945. And several hits, 8-inch hits, 6-inch hits, 5-inch hits, all of which came from cruisers and destroyers. Well, we were still afloat, although a number of the hits had been below the water line. We'd taken a lot of water and we'd started to list, that means to lean, and our planes to come back couldn't land on our ship because they couldn't land on a tilting flat top. And several of we were hit by 2 kamikazes that destroyed our flight deck was made out of lumber, Douglas fir lumber, and because it was never expected that anything like this would happen. So we had fires aboard ship, we had leakage, we had water pouring into the hull, and we came about that close to getting the order to abandon ship. This was a long battle. Sea battles aren't nearly as long as land battles. They can be more ferocious and more intense. But a sea battle of 3 hours is a very long battle. That means there's a lot of ships firing at each other and planes and all that sort of thing. And that battle took about 2 hours and 45, 2 hours and 50 minutes. And it was a long, long siege because we were constantly under attack. Then all of a sudden, in a rain squall and with our tin can escorts, destroyers and destroyer escorts laying down smoke screens, behind which we were able to hide, except the wind had come along and blow the smoke away. You know, then there we were exposed again. And then the Japs were firing at us. But anyway, we managed to get out of that. The Japanese admiral, for some reason, and we're not exactly sure even today, the actual reason that he withdrew. But we think it might have been that he thought he was getting sucked into a vortex, and also that Admiral Halsey and his big carrier, fast carrier task force had ranged far north to destroy those other carriers up there, and Halsey didn't realize that they had no planes. He didn't even need to be up there, and that was an embarrassment for Bull Halsey. But anyway, when he finally found out, then he headed back, but by that time it was too late. But by that time, Admiral Kurita, the Japanese admiral, had determined, haul ass, pardon the expression, but that's the way it is, and get out of here, save our necks. And of course we were very thankful for that, although we were trailed by a Japanese submarine for about 30 minutes after the withdrawal of the Japanese fleet. And that's another quick story. we were still in rain squalls, and we were so badly damaged. We had a 13-degree list, which means that if you looked at the carrier deck, here's level, 13 degrees would be about like that. Well, if you tried to walk on that and it was raining and wet, you slid down. You know, you could have slid off the ship. So that was the desperation. Our damage control crew on the ship was stuffing the water line, the below water line shell holes with furniture from the offices aboard ship, mess tables, mattresses, anything they could lay their hands on to try and hold the water out from the holes of the ship. So anyway, that was a very exciting time, and we got some emergency repairs in New Guinea. We'd sailed about 200 miles south during the day and late afternoon and early evening to New Guinea to get these emergency repairs, just to get us back to Pearl Harbor, to get more emergency repairs, to get us back to the mainland. So that was a very exciting time, and our group of 13 ships was nicknamed Taffy 3. And if you read some of these histories, you'll see the name Taffy 3. And that was our task group of 6 carriers, 4 destroyers, and 3 destroyer escorts. Several of our ships were sunk. We lost 3 carriers from our task group. We lost 3 of the 6 carriers. We lost 2 of the destroyers and 1 of the destroyer escorts. It was a very, very desperate day, and it was a great loss. But our ship was very lucky. We took the most hits. The Cullinan Bay took the most hits of enemy surface vessels. And one more instance about that battle, and then I'll move on a little bit, and I'm getting a little long in the wind here. But I told you about a submarine, a Japanese submarine that was trailing us in the water. Because we were leaking oil, and it was very obvious to the enemy. Well, follow the oil, you know. We'll find a ship somewhere. And here was this huge submarine. It was what they called an I-class Japanese submarine. It could carry 120 troops. It could carry 6 tanks and all kinds of machine guns and so forth. It was a super, super sub. And carried about, I don't know, 40 torpedoes. Well, she had come up, the periscope was up, she had fired a brace of torpedoes at us. We were tail end Charlie because our speed had been greatly reduced. And we didn't know about the Japanese submarine, and she fired a brace of torpedoes. A couple of them we found out later were duds, but there was one that was alive, and it was headed right for our stern. There was a plane, one of our planes, not from our ship, but from another ship that had been sunk. And this great pilot was looking around for somewhere to land, and he came over us wagging his wings. You saw he couldn't land on our ship. His ship was sunk. What was he going to do? Well, he looked down and he saw that submarine. And he fired his wing rockets and his 50 caliber machine guns at it. Exploded that live torpedo about 100 yards before it got to us. So, you know, there's another story. Thanks be to God and good luck and so forth and so on. But you know about toward the end of the war and so forth.
Excuse me. What happened to the pilot?
Well, that's a good question. That's a wonderful question, and we never knew for a while. Our ship, we started having annual reunions in 1986. Took us a long time to get organized, like 40 years. By this time, the old Cullinan Bay had been cut up for razor blades, you know, long gone. But 1986, I was instrumental in helping get a a reunion started, and we had a reunion out in San Diego. The original ship's company was about 500 men, sailors and officers, small ship. With a squadron aboard, there would be about 700. Of course, the squadron wasn't always aboard, but when they were aboard, we had about 700 people aboard the ship. So in 1986, a lot of our guys had died. We lost in the battle, we lost about 8 men who were killed aboard the ship. And those were mostly killed by the explosion of the kamikaze planes. But, so we had this, we finally got this reunion organized, and we had a nice turnout in San Diego. Well, the word got out through Navy publications and so forth. And the next year, one of our surviving pilots got a letter from a guy in Houston, Texas. He said, "I don't know if you know about me." He wrote, can you imagine? He said, "I was the pilot of the TBM torpedo bomber that flew over you, tried to find a place to land, couldn't land, saw the torpedo in the water, saw the Japanese submarine just below the surface, fired at it and exploded that torpedo." Well, we were so overjoyed and thrilled. And of course, he was invited to our next reunion.
Mm-hmm.
And he was with us for about 10 years. We do it annually, still do. We're down in numbers now. But he came for about 8 or 9 years, and then he became ill and eventually died. So that's a true story, and it's a great story. A lot of people say, "Oh, you guys, you old vets, you get together and you tell stories and wild sea tales and all that sort of thing. Every time you tell a story, it gets a little more embellished, it gets a little better, it gets a little riper, it gets a little wilder." So, we have to be, I try and be careful about these things and not overdo them. But, there are so many wonderful books that you can read about this stuff. And I encourage you to, if you don't buy them, go to the library. Half-price books is a wonderful place to find reference books and things like that, great stories. So anyway, the rest of the war, at that point I had been at sea for almost 3 years, intermittently, off and on. I had about 3 years of actual sea duty, which was a long time and a lot. And the Navy said, "Gardner, we think you need a reward." I'd never been wounded, I was lucky. And, how would you like to have some shore duty? Oh boy, I'll take that. This was in, this was right after, a month after the Battle off Samar. So it would be late November of 1944. And I got 30 days leave because the ship went into dry dock in Long Beach to be rebuilt, repaired. And I got my orders when I was home. Report to St. Mary's College in Moraga, California, which is near San Francisco. And I thought, wow, can't get any better duty than that. The Navy had a pre-flight base there at St. Mary's College. And pre-flight is not, it's exactly what it says. It's for the cadets to get some more education before they go into primary training, actual flight training. And I was a history instructor. And oh, that was wonderful duty. My gosh, I had every weekend in San Francisco, and San Francisco is a great liberty town, and Fleet City and all that sort of thing. So eventually, and then I went into flight training after the war. At the end of the war, I went into flight training. And then I decided that things, a lot of things happened. There was a big, immediately after the war, there was a big peeling back of armed forces, and they wanted to cut costs, and the Department of Defense was just beginning to be formed at that time. Up until that point, there was a Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Air Corps, before it became the Air Force, and those were all cabinet seats in the government. Then they combined them all those services, into what we know of today as the Department of Defense. And there's one cabinet seat, and that's the Secretary of Defense, and today it's Donald Rumsfeld, as you know. So there was a big cutting back, financial stress and all that sort of thing. So I decided, because I wanted to go back to college and get my degree and so forth and so on, that it was time to get out. I've had mixed emotions about that ever since. Sometimes I wish I'd stayed in. But nevertheless, it was a great, great experience. That gives you a little bit of the idea of what went on in my small world. I want to leave you with a couple of look-backs. One of the look-backs is, in World War I, and you know, we didn't get into World War I until 1917. World War I was from August of 1914 to November of 1918. And the British and the French and the Russians fought the Germans. The Allies were the British, the French, and the Russians. Now, the Russians were knocked out early in the war. They had millions and millions of men, but they were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and the Germans pretty handily defeated the Russians. By the end of 1915, early 1916, Russia was no longer a strength in World War I. They were called the Central Powers. The Germans, the Italians, until later in the war, the Italians decided to come on the side of the Allies, because they knew where the winners were. But anyway, so in 1915 particularly, there were these terrible, terrible battles in France and Belgium. One of the battles was Ypres, Y-P-R-E-S. In typical American fashion, Yanks called it wipers. But it's Ypres, and it was a terrible, horrible battle in which, you know, hundreds of thousands of men were killed on both sides, British, French, and German. And that was the terrible French warfare of World War I. Well, there's a story about Flanders Field in Belgium was a burial ground for soldiers killed in battle. White crosses, row upon row upon row upon row. And there was a Canadian doctor who was in the medical corps of the Canadian Army. And of course, Canada was a very strong ally of ours, you know, and they fought bravely in France. He saw so many of these wounded boys and the dead boys, and one of his best friends was killed. And he was so touched by this, and he was a pretty good writer besides being a doctor and a surgeon. And he wrote this poem. Some of you may have read it, some of you may not. It's called In Flanders Fields. And I'm going to read it to you. By Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, medical doctor, Canadian Army, 1915. Just imagine. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place when in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard, among the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up your quarrel with the foe. To you from falling hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. Now, you all know about Memorial Day and the poppies that are sold by our veterans. That's where that comes from. They got the idea to make this a memorial that you give $1 for or $5 for. You get a poppy, and you put it in your lapel, and you wear it proudly. But that's where the idea came from. A lot of people don't know that. So, a young woman in New York who was with the YMCA in 1918 read about this poem and heard the story about it. Miss Moyna Michael, 2 days before Armistice Day, and you all know what Armistice Day is. Today we call it Veterans Day. The 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. As a matter of fact, the armistice, or the peace, was called at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. Well, she saw this poem of Flanders Fields and was so touched by it that she wrote, "We shall keep the faith," in answer to, those of you who you have thrown the torch. Remember the words in here? And her poem goes like this: "Oh, you who sleep in Flanders Fields, sleep sweet to rise anew. We caught the torch you threw, and holding high, we keep the faith with all who died. We cherish too the poppy red that grows on fields where valor led. It seems to signal to the skies that blood of heroes never dies, but lends a luster to the red of the flower that blooms above the dead in Flanders Fields. And now the torch and the poppy red we wear in honor of our dead. Fear not that ye have died for naught. We'll teach the lesson that ye brought in Flanders Fields." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. I wish you did my history teacher in high school. So much more. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions, Mr. Gardner?
Sure, questions, don't be bashful. I have a lot of fun. I do school presentations, and junior year, if you've got a school that would invite me sometime, let me know. I'll be happy to come and talk to your school. I love fifth graders particularly. Fifth graders are wonderful. Everybody's wonderful, but fifth graders are just particularly wonderful because they've got some smarts, they've already got some education, they've got a thought process, they're not crybabies, and they're questioning, and I love it. And they ask amazing questions, and it's a great fun to talk to fifth graders. High schoolers, well, they're a little different. And then you get the college students, and oh boy, I don't know. Sometimes I think I'm wasting my time talking to some college students, but it's a privilege on my part to be able to do this. And again, let me tell you about this wonderful museum, and you know about it, of course, and I can't wait till you get finished, and I know you can't either, but it's going to be great. And the expansion of your collection here, and it's given me some thoughts, because I know where there are some other collections that might be available in the future.
Great.
So we'll keep that in mind.
We are a transportation museum, so if you've got boats, planes, trains, any connection you have,
I know it.
be great.
It's wonderful. And
Battleships, cruisers.
one further thing, if you're interested and want to find out about it, There is what we call the Tri-State Warbird Museum in Clermont County Airport. It's a great place. We've got planes out there. They'll just knock your socks off when you see them rebuilt. Not only rebuilt to look at, but to fly. And we have flyovers out there with a P-51 Mustang or a B-25 bomber. Oh, it's exciting. It's wonderful. So, anything else? Anybody got? Yeah.
They had the P-51 from that museum, flew 2 years ago at Blue Ash. I've gone out to that museum, it's very nice.
Yes.
I'm part of an aviation meeting every month at Lunken. They're trying to set up a museum. They have a lot of World War II artifacts.
Right.
But are you involved in the Veterans History Project at the Cincinnati Library?
I am indeed.
Yeah, you've done some interviews for that?
Yeah.
Started it.
Yeah, I helped get it organized here at the public library in downtown. And that is a wonderful program, and what it amounts to quickly is interviewing, and right now we're concentrating on World War II veterans, because we're dying at the rate of 3,000 or more a day now. The mortality rate on the graph is straight up. Yes?
Do they have to be local veterans?
Well, wherever they live, there probably is a public library to contact about that. What do you have in mind?
I have an uncle that served in World War II.
Where is he?
He's in Norfolk, Virginia.
Oh, well, I know, they've got the program down there. You might tell him, tip him up about it, and he can call the local library there and find out about it if he doesn't know about it. Norfolk of all places, my goodness, yes. There are hundreds of thousands of veterans down there. I just came back from Beaufort, South Carolina. I went down to see Parris Island. I'd never seen it before. And Parris Island is a great Marine base there right near Beaufort. And it's a wonderful place. But this interview program, I've done now 27 interviews.
When are they conducting them, on Fridays, Saturdays, or?
Any day, whenever they can, whenever the veteran is available. For example, this past week, they were doing them at Blue Ash. The week before that, we were doing them at Cheviot. The week before that, we were doing it at Anderson. So I've done them at Blue Ash, Anderson, Cheviot, Green Township, Delhi, downtown. I'm sure that the project is in action here in northern Kentucky. And it is a wonderful program because, just like you're doing, you videograph, you have the interviewer and the interviewee, and we start talking. And I have a lot of fun with it because I learn so much and meet so many interesting people too.
I took the class, I think back in March or something, at Cincinnati Library, and haven't done an interview yet.
Okay, have they called
for
you?
the library. They contacted me, I think in June, saying they were setting up schedules. There was, I think, 28 of us in the class, but I have done some interviews on my own over here with veterans from Vietnam, Korea, and Persian Gulf War.
Right. Well, we'll eventually get to those, but first
right.
we're doing the WW tours because we're losing them pretty rapidly. And I lost in the last 30 days. I lost 3 shipmates from the Kalinin Bay. I lost one. I'm the last survivor of the picket boat in Guadalcanal. All the officers are gone. I'm the last one now. One of my buddies, who was 90 years old, died about 3 weeks ago. So that's what's happening.
How big was the picket boat? How big was that
Yeah,
picket boat?
Oh!
Same question.
Yeah, I didn't tell you about that. If you'd like to, quickly, I'll tell you about it. It had a very interesting history. It had been a private yacht. It was a wooden ship, wooden craft, and the owner lived in Massachusetts, and I think he was the president of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in the beginning of the war, Roosevelt was very charismatic. He had lots and lots of buddies, Of course, he'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, before World War II started. And he was the third cousin of President Theodore Roosevelt as well. Anyway, as the story goes, apocryphal it might be, FDR, you know, called his buddy Joe and said, "Joe, you got that beautiful yacht?" And she was about 94 feet long, made of wood, had beautiful appointments in it, could sleep 6, mahogany on the bulkheads and everything else. It was a luxury yacht. So the guy gave it to the Navy. Well, the Navy, of course, revised it, took out all of the appointments. They put a 3-inch gun on the forepeak of the vessel, and 230 caliber machine guns. That was our armament. You know, 2 pea shooters and a BB gun. That's what it amounted to, really. Fortunately, we didn't have to rely on those things because the enemy never got that close to us. But we had a crew. We had a crew of 3 officers and 16 sailors.
Wow.
And you talk about tight living quarters, boy, that was it. But, and you know, a small craft like that in the deep ocean, you know, it's like sitting on a bouncing cork. And
Was it a motor yacht or a sailing yacht?
no, it was a motor. Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, the Navy, she was a motor yacht to begin with sail. She was a combination as a civilian ship. But the Navy put on a pretty good engine on it, and of course demasted her and all that sort of thing. So that was Pickett boat. It was called PC number 121. That was her official Navy designation. And I was on her for about 3.5 months. Then when we had pretty well secured the Solomon Islands by that time, of course we were still fighting on Bougainville and New Britain, Ireland, New Ireland, Tulagi. We were still fighting the Japs on those islands. But Guadalcanal was the key, and once we had secured and had repulsed the enemy from Guadalcanal, we really had the control of the area, pretty much so, because it was a great base. And Pappy Boynton and his Black Sheep flew off Guadalcanal, you know. I didn't see those guys because we never went ashore. We never got ashore. I had one friend from Cincinnati who, here I go again, but this is something that some of you might not know about. During the war, there was an organization called the Coast Watchers. Has any of you ever heard of the Coast Watchers? Okay. Coast Watchers were generally Australian and New Zealand men who had stayed in those southern islands. They had been maybe planters, sugarcane farmers, coconut farmers, so forth and so on, in peacetime. Well, the war came along, and the Japanese, of course, moved into that area. That was called the Dutch East Indies in the early days, and the British Solomon Islands. Now today it's all Indonesia, 7th largest nation in the world, and one of the most volatile, I might say. But anyway, the Coast Watchers were left on these islands in strategic locations to spy on the Japanese. They had a little radio transmitter. They usually had the help of some native people who were allies and friendly to the British, friendly to these people, and were runners and suppliers and so forth. And the Coast Watchers kept an eye out in their areas. One of our great ships, the USS Helena, which was a light cruiser, was sunk in the Battle of Savo Island, which took place between the battles of Savo Island and another big battle, a bigger battle, and Midway. Midway was in June of 1942. These battles were, and this was when we were still losing. And that's another story, you know, that's the story for the Tokyo Raiders. That idea was to bolster the morale, the sagging morale, not only of our military, but our nation. We were all sad as heck, because we weren't winning any battles. We'd lost the Philippines, you know, it was terrible. So anyway, the USS Helena was sunk in this battle. Survivors, of which there were very few, there were about 1,000 sailors and officers aboard a light cruiser. So you can imagine, there were only about 300 who survived the sinking of the Helena. And you know, cruisers were named after state capitals. Did you know that?
Oh.
Yep. There was USS Cincinnati, USS Columbus, USS Pittsburgh, USS Boston, New York, Atlanta, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco. All of these were great cruisers. And Helena, of course, is the state capital of what state? Okay, I'm
Montana.
embarrassed. Right, Montana. Put that in your geography pocket. But anyway, the Helena was sunk. Hundreds of men were lost. There were a few survivors. There was a young officer from Cincinnati by the name of George Boswine, rest his soul, who surfaced in these dangerous waters which were full of sharks, as well as enemy. And he was the only officer with about 27 men. And they had one of those big life rafts with the network wooden decking between the big surroundings of inflated rubber. And they scrambled aboard this thing, and he was the only officer. And here he was only 21 at the time, you know, and or 22. And some of those men, you know, were old grizzled Navy veterans, some of them of the old China fleet and so forth. But because he was the officer, he was in charge. And they maneuvered their life raft toward the shore. They got hung up on a coral reef. Well, it punctured the life raft. And there they were, high and dry, on this coral reef in high tide. Well, the tide was going to change. It was going to be low tide pretty soon. And they'd be out there exposed not only to the blazing sun, but also the enemy. Well, there was a coast watcher up in the hills, and he saw the action of the battle. He saw these survivors come in, and he sent his native men racing down the hillside, and they got these guys off this coral reef, saved their lives, hid them away. There were Japs on the island. So you had to be very, very careful. You had to be very wily and very able to hide and run and camouflage and everything, you know. So anyway, my friend lived and became a very successful businessman in Cincinnati. He's since died. But the Coast Watchers is a very interesting. There's a book by Walter Lord. Walter Lord wrote so many wonderful books. One of his most famous books was A Night to Remember, which is the story of the sinking of the Titanic. Walter Lord, a very famous American historian. And he wrote this book about, it isn't called The Coast Watchers, but your librarian can help you with it. I can't think of the title. It's something like The Watchers or something like that. But it's a great story, and it's something that a lot of people don't know about.
Are there any cruiser museums in the U.S. that you know of?
Cruiser
The
museums?
ships left that you can go on board?
Oh, yeah. Oh, there are quite a number of them. Buffalo, New York. There's a submarine in Cleveland up in the Lakeshore Park, right at the edge of the lake. That was a World War II diesel submarine called the Cod. Pittsburgh has World War II submarine. Out in Alameda, California is the CV-12, which was the second Hornet carrier. The first Hornet carrier was CV-8, and that was the one that carried the Doolittle Raiders to Japan. As a matter of fact, I'll bet your library has it. There's a book on naval museums, where they are, where they're located, how to get to them, how much it costs to go aboard and all that. The Alabama, down in Mobile, the battleship Alabama, there are lots of them around. And I know people that make annual trips, you know. Can't do it all in 1 year, there's so many of them, there are hundreds of them. You know, Battleship Cove, of course, near Boston is one of the greatest. Wilmington, North Carolina has the Battleship North Carolina. Yeah, they're cruisers as well. And of course, there's a great memorial in Indianapolis to the lost cruiser, the Indianapolis. That's another horrible story that people ask me to tell about sometimes. But I've gone on much too long.
No.
I promised you 15 minutes.
Is that the shark story, the Indianapolis?
Yeah.
Where they-
Yeah.
You know, an example that probably people would relate to, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the Frenchman in the musical South Pacific, he was a coast watcher, correct?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Some enchanted evening.
You will be the coast watcher.
Gonna wash that man right out of my head. Well, that was another great story. You know, James Michener, the author, was just he was a fantastic American. He was a patriot of the highest order, and he loved his country. He was a Texan. He loved his country, and Tales of the South Pacific is one of the great books, and of course became a great Broadway musical and then a movie too. So I'm through, unless you've got another question.
Could you just touch on, you said you were on destroyers during World War II? Also, did you serve on a destroyer?
No, I did not. No, I was not on a destroyer.
Okay.
No, my second ship was a transport vessel, and I was only on her about 2 months, and then I got the orders for the baby carrier.
Okay.
And I was very lucky. And that carrier was launched in Vancouver, Washington on the Columbia River, and my home was 30 miles away in a town named Hillsborough, which is just west of Portland. And then those ships, when they came down the ways, of course they needed all kinds of equipment and everything, and they were floated down the Columbia River to Astoria, Oregon, which is right at the mouth of the Columbia, where it flows into the Pacific Ocean. And there was a big naval base there, and they were outfitted there. These ships were outfitted. That was putting all the supplies aboard, putting the guns aboard, making living accommodations and everything. Well, that port of Astoria was 70 miles from my hometown. So in 1942, my parents drove me into Portland, put me aboard the Southern Pacific train at the Union Station in Portland in 1942. Then I came back in 43, and they drove me to Astoria in the family car and put me aboard the carrier. And I'll never forget my mother. She was a basket case by that time. But I was very lucky, very lucky. So that Taffy 3, as a matter of fact, was awarded the Naval Presidential Unit Citation, which is one of the prestigious group awards. And we're all allowed to wear the medal and the ribbon of the Presidential Unit Citation. Have me back sometime and I'll tell you about my meeting with Winston Churchill. That's another topic.
I'd like to give you our DVDs
Oh, my
of
goodness.
our interviews. We have interviewed now 30 veterans
Isn't
and
that
10 homefront
nice?
people.
Oh, you're so nice. Thank you so much. I just love it. Well, I'm very appreciative to you all, and I know you're doing such a wonderful job, and your dedication to history is so important. We've got to keep it alive. And Thank you again.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'll be back.
Thank you. Okay, let's see, it's a little tall, so I'm gonna pull this out a little bit. He was an engineer.
Okay, come on.
Okay, got it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you more about, is there a time limit for the veterans on the history project as to how long they can talk, or?
An hour.
An hour.
The tape is an hour tape. And I must admit, I've been unable to stop a couple of guys who ran over, and of course what they talked about was lost after the tape ran out.
No, they're putting them on the website, some of the stories, but they've probably taken thousands of stories nationwide, I think.
Oh my goodness, yes.
They've been doing this since 1992, I think.
Oh, and particularly around Washington, you know. With
They took a lot when they dedicated the World War II memorial, I guess.
Exactly. And the Navy Memorial, which is downtown, and over at Arlington, at the Marine Memorial, and at the cemetery. And of course, then, you know, places like Norfolk and big naval bases and army bases around the country. But it's a wonderful program, and I think it'll be nice. You know, the so many families that I've talked to over the years have said, "Oh my gosh, my dad or my grandfather wouldn't talk about his experiences, and we're so sorry he never got it down." Or I tell people, look, if you don't want to talk in public or be on tape or film or anything like that, get yourself a tape, get a tape recorder. You know, go off in the corner by yourself in your basement and just talk.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, wow, I never thought about that.
Yeah,
That's a good
anything.
idea. Then your family will have something.
Right.
There's so many families don't have anything.
Yeah.
You know, the guy that wrote Flags of Our Fathers,
Mm-hmm.
James Bradley, that's how it all got started. He didn't, his father was one of the flag raisers on Iwo Jima and never talked about it
Yeah.
until he had died.
Right.
And Bradley went into the family files and found all this stuff about what his father had done.
Yeah, I'm reading that book right now.
Yeah. Well, see the movie too. It's a shame.
Yeah, I saw the movie.
Oh,
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah, I had a lot of family history. My grandfather's in World War I, my dad was World War II in Korea, and my uncle never spoke about, he was in Normandy, and he met Glenn Miller before he went down in the plane crash, and we found all these pictures of, you know, battle-scarred Europe after he passed away. And, yeah, there's a lot
Goodness sakes, that's
of good
valuable
stories
stuff.
that are gone, yeah.
That's valuable stuff.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thanks
for
again. You're
for
all
telling
so,
us about it.
well, you're so very nice, and I appreciate
Yeah.
it.